My name is Linda. At 59, I never imagined I'd find myself crouched behind the wheel of my car, parked across from a stranger's house, watching my husband through the half-closed slats of a fence as he lit candles and practiced wedding vows to someone who wasn't me. But that's exactly what happened, and it all started with a single message that popped up on his laptop late one Tuesday night. The kind of message you never expect to see after 32 years of what you thought was a perfectly ordinary, loyal, safe marriage. John and I met when we were both in our 20s. He was already on his way to becoming a financial advisor, and I had just taken a job at a local community center. We were both cautious people, not prone to grand romantic gestures, but somehow we fell into a quiet kind of love, the dependable kind, where you build a life not with sparks but with structure, with routines, with years of birthdays, burnt pancakes on Sunday mornings, and the kind of deep knowing that comes from decades of watching someone load the dishwasher the wrong way and deciding it's not worth fighting over anymore. Our life was peaceful, maybe too peaceful, and even when the kids moved out and the house got a little quieter, I never suspected anything was wrong. I thought his late nights were just part of his job, his silence at dinner, just the weariness of middle age, and the fact that he no longer kissed me before bed. Something I chose to explain away with tired logic instead of fear, because the truth is, I didn't want to see what was right in front of me. It wasn't until I walked past the kitchen that night and saw his laptop left open, a rarity for John, who guarded his electronics like a vault, that I noticed the message, just a short preview, no name attached, but the words hit me like a slap. "Don't be nervous. You'll do amazing. I can't wait to see you at the altar." I stared at it for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself that I'd misunderstood, that maybe it was a joke, a message meant for someone else, or part of some surprise renewal ceremony he was planning for us, because that's how deep the denial goes when you've loved someone for more than half your life. But the thing is, once the seed is planted, once the suspicion takes root, it grows fast. By the next morning, I was watching him more closely, noting every strange phone call, every little white lie, and I remembered that 2 months earlier, he'd mentioned a conference out of town, but had come back without a single receipt or photo or story to share, just a dull expression and a sudden urge to repaint the garage. I didn't confront him. I couldn't. Not yet. So I waited until he went for a jog and then opened his email using the password he hadn't changed since 2012. It took only 5 minutes to confirm what I feared. He had an entirely separate thread of conversations with a woman named A. There were no last names, no photos, but their messages were full of coded affection, hotel addresses, and what sounded an awful lot like wedding planning, including venue details, catering lists, and something called a rehearsal flow. That word stuck in my mind. Rehearsal. For what? Not a show. Not a work event. A wedding. I told him I needed to visit our daughter in Raleigh, packed a bag and left early the next morning, but I didn't go to Raleigh. I used the shared family GPS account that John never paid attention to and tracked his location to a residential neighborhood 2 towns over, where he seemed to be spending more and more of his time. I parked my car a few houses away and waited. Around 5:30 p.m., I saw him pull up, dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt, holding a small garment bag and bouquet of white roses, and I followed him with my eyes as he walked casually around to the backyard of a modest brick house, as if this were the most normal thing in the world for a married man to do on a Wednesday evening. After he left, I approached the house. No one answered the door, but I wasn't interested in explanations, not yet, so I walked around to the back and saw something that didn't make sense. A wooden arch partially wrapped in tulle, folding chairs stacked along the fence, a box of glass candle holders labeled wedding prep, and a single piece of paper resting on the seat of a chair beneath the arch. The word vows written across the top in my husband's handwriting. I should have walked away right then, but something kept me rooted to the spot, something between rage and heartbreak, and I made a choice I never thought I'd make. I came back that night, parked across the street, turned off my headlights, and waited. At 7:12 p.m., John returned. He was wearing the same suit he wore to our son's college graduation. He walked slowly to the backyard, lit 2 candles, and stood under the arch like a groom waiting for his bride. Only there was no one else there. No music, no camera crew, no woman in white. Just John and the night and the quiet flicker of candlelight. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out the folded piece of paper, and began to speak. I couldn't hear everything, but the words I did catch stopped my breath. I choose you. Every version of you. I choose freedom. I choose the life I was always too afraid to live. And then, when he was done, he closed his eyes, held out his hands as if inviting someone into them, and leaned forward as if to kiss the air. I sat frozen behind the wheel, heart pounding, throat tight, not knowing whether to laugh, scream, or cry. Because I wasn't just looking at a man having an affair. I was looking at a man who was playing out an entire ceremony with no one there but himself and his imagination. It wasn't just betrayal. It was performance. It was delusion. It was something deeper, stranger, and far more dangerous than I'd ever prepared myself to face. And that was the moment I realized, whatever John had become, whoever he really was, I was only just beginning to find out. I didn't sleep that night, not even a little, and I didn't cry either, which might sound strange, considering I had just watched my husband of 32 years perform what could only be described as a solo wedding rehearsal in someone else's backyard, complete with candlelight, handwritten vows, and a kiss to thin air. But there was something about the surrealness of it all that pushed my grief aside and replaced it with a sharp, cold clarity that I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. The next morning, I sat in a diner off the highway with a cup of burnt coffee and a notebook I'd grabbed from the back seat, the kind I used to keep grocery lists in. And for the first time in my life, I started making a list not of chores or errands or things to do around the house, but of questions I didn't yet have answers to, but couldn't afford to ignore anymore. Like, who is A? Where does she live? How long has this been going on? What does he want from her? What kind of man rehearses vows to someone who isn't there? I knew I had to keep playing it cool with John, at least until I figured out what I was actually dealing with. So when he called me that afternoon to check in, I kept my voice calm and casual, even smiled into the phone like I was really sitting on my daughter's porch in Raleigh, sipping iced tea and helping her reorganize the garage, when, in reality, I was sitting in my car behind a gas station, watching a real estate agent unlock the front door of the house where he'd been the night before. I waited until they both went inside, then made my move, not to confront, not yet, but to learn. I approached the neighbor's house and introduced myself as Lisa, an old friend of the woman next door. And to my surprise, the elderly man watering his roses gave me exactly what I needed without even being asked. "You mean Amy? Sweet girl. Bit younger than him, but she's been fixing the place up. Said she's getting married next week. Don't see them much during the day, but he's been coming by at night. I thought it was a little odd, but you know how people are these days." I nodded, smiled, and thanked him for his time, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear myself think, because there it was, her name, Amy, and the confirmation that this wasn't just some fantasy he was acting out alone. It was real, and it was happening soon. I drove back to a cheap motel, the kind with flickering hallway lights and sheets that smelled like bleach, and opened my phone to the email account I'd been quietly monitoring since I found that first message. Sure enough, there it was. Another email from Amy, this time with an attachment titled, "Our Song Choices," and a short message, "Don't worry, baby. No one will know. You've kept your secret this long. We're almost there." I read that last line over and over again until the words stopped making sense, because that's when something shifted inside me. Not just anger or betrayal, but something colder and more calculating. He wasn't just cheating. He wasn't just leaving. He was lying to her too. He hadn't told her about me. She didn't know he was married. She didn't know he was living a double life. And suddenly, I realized that if I played this right, I wasn't just the victim of this story. I could rewrite it entirely. I spent the next 2 days learning everything I could about Amy. Her full name was easy to find from one of the email signatures. From there, it took me less than an hour to find her Instagram, her LinkedIn, and a Pinterest board titled "Forever Starts Here," filled with images of lavender bouquets, lace dresses, and honeymoon destinations. She was 39, worked in marketing, and had apparently met John at a conference almost a year earlier, according to a photo captioned, "Who knew one dinner in Dallas would change my whole life?" and I couldn't help but think, oh, honey, you have no idea. But the most important discovery wasn't about Amy. It was about John. I noticed that every weekend, without fail, he sent her money through a shared Venmo account. Small amounts at first, then bigger ones, marked with emojis or vague notes like venue deposit, dress fittings, or cake. I added it all up. He'd spent over $11,000 on this secret wedding. $11,000 of our money. That's when the idea started forming. Not revenge in the movie kind of way, not fire and drama and scandal, but something quieter, smarter, and far more satisfying. I didn't want to ruin his wedding. I wanted to walk right into it, calmly, confidently, and let him ruin it for himself. But first, I needed more proof. I needed to know if he had filed any paperwork, marriage licenses, property transfers, bank changes. I had a friend named Bev who worked at the county clerk's office, and after one awkward phone call and a long explanation involving a cousin's fiancé who might be scamming someone, Bev agreed to check. The next day, she called me back and said, "Linda, you're not gonna like this. He filed a marriage license under a different name. He used his middle name as his last name. That's why it didn't pop up right away. So he wasn't just sneaking around. He was trying to disappear." That night, I stared at my reflection in the motel mirror, still wearing the same blouse I'd worn 3 days earlier. Makeup half smudged, eyes dry and burning. I thought about the years I spent organizing his calendar, cooking his favorite meals, cheering him on at every promotion, covering for him with the kids when he worked late, only to find out that while I was clipping coupons and checking in on his aging mother, he was buying rings and planning first dances with someone else. And still, part of me wondered, what if he'd gotten away with it? What if I'd never seen that message? What if I'd gone to Raleigh like I said I would, spent the weekend helping my daughter, come home to a kiss on the cheek and another quiet dinner, never knowing I'd been erased? But I did see it, and I was done playing the quiet wife. So I packed up my things, checked out of the motel, and made a reservation for a boutique salon 2 towns over. If I was going to walk into that wedding, I was going to do it looking like the woman he should have stayed faithful to. And as I slid behind the wheel, I said out loud, just to hear it in the air, "You wanted a new life, John? Fine, but I'm the one bringing the ending." There's a strange kind of courage that comes over you once you've crossed a line you never imagined approaching. And by the time I sat across the street from Amy's house again, this time in a dress I hadn't worn in 5 years, and with a fresh set of curls courtesy of a stylist named Lacey who didn't ask questions, I no longer felt like the version of myself who used to wait by the door for John to come home with takeout and a story from his day. I felt sharper, quieter, like a woman who had seen too much and decided to stay standing anyway. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, 3 days away, and I knew I couldn't just show up without knowing more, not only about Amy, but about the illusion she had built with my husband. So when I saw her step out of her house that afternoon, phone in hand and keys dangling from her fingers, I made a split-second decision that had my heart slamming against my chest before I even fully committed to it. I followed her. She didn't go far, just to a local coffee shop with pastel chairs and overpriced iced lattes, the kind of place I used to take our daughter when she was little, and I sat 2 tables behind her, pretending to scroll through my phone while she ordered something called a lavender oat cloud and settled into a seat near the window. I hadn't expected her to be so ordinary. No dramatic makeup, no designer purse, just jeans, a soft sweater, and a notebook she flipped open like she did this every day. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She was on the phone with someone. I couldn't hear everything, but it sounded like she was talking to her sister, and she said, "He's sweet, you know? I know it's sudden, but when you meet someone and just know, you don't wait." That word, "know," landed heavy in my chest. I had thought I knew John too, for 32 years, and yet here he was, telling a different woman a different truth. I was just about to leave when it happened. Amy stood up, turned around, and made direct eye contact with me. For half a second, I was sure the whole thing was over. She'd seen me. She'd recognized something in my face. Suspicion, pain, familiarity, and I sat frozen, heart hammering, hands gripping my purse so tightly I felt the skin on my knuckles stretch. She took one step forward, my breath caught, and then she smiled politely as if I were just another woman waiting for her drink, and turned back to the counter. I sat there for another minute, pretending to check a message that didn't exist, before calmly walking out the door and around the corner, where I leaned against the wall and tried not to laugh or cry, or both at the same time, because in that tiny moment, it all could have unraveled. Everything I was planning, everything I hadn't even figured out yet, but it didn't. When I got back to my car, I couldn't stop thinking about her eyes. There was no guilt in them, no calculation. She really didn't know. John hadn't told her about me. He hadn't told her about the 32 years, the house, the kids, the long winters we spent saving for retirement, the surgeries, the deaths in the family, the things that glue a life together. Not one word. She thought she was marrying a clean slate. I could have confronted her then. I could have stood up, walked over, said, "Hi, I'm the wife," and watched her face collapse under the weight of a truth she never asked for. But I didn't, because I realized something in that moment that changed everything. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about exposing him. And to do that right, I needed her to stay innocent just a little longer. So I went home, to our home, the one he still technically shared with me when he wasn't playing fiancé in another zip code, and I waited for him to return. He came through the door with a bag of groceries and a kiss to my cheek, so practiced, so casual, that it made my stomach turn. I almost said something right then, almost asked, "Did you buy almond milk for Amy too? Or, do you still say vows to the mirror when I'm asleep upstairs?" But I didn't, because I needed one more piece of the puzzle before I could make my move. The next morning, he told me he had another late meeting, and I nodded, kissed his cheek back, and told him to drive safe. Then I waited 15 minutes, grabbed my keys, and followed him again. He drove out toward the hills, the nicer part of town where people have horses and stone mailboxes, and I stayed far enough behind that he wouldn't see me, but close enough to see where he pulled in. Amy's driveway. He got out with a black suit in a garment bag. She met him at the door in a long cream-colored robe. They hugged for a long time, and then, just before they stepped inside, I watched her place her hands on either side of his face and say something I couldn't hear. But his expression shifted in a way I hadn't seen in years. Soft, open, almost boyish, and for one brief moment, I realized he wasn't just pretending to be someone else. He had become someone else. That thought hit me harder than anything. It wasn't that he'd cheated. It wasn't even that he'd lied. It was that the version of him I had loved and built a life around had disappeared. And this new version was living a story I'd never been invited into. I sat in my car long after they went inside, staring at the stillness of the house, thinking about how easily people can build entire lives in secret, just blocks away from the ones they've already built. And for the first time, I didn't feel broken. I felt dangerous. I was going to the wedding. I was going to stand in the same room as both of them, wearing my best dress and my calmest smile. But when I opened my mouth, it wouldn't be to scream or cry or throw things. It would be to tell the truth. And I had just 3 days left to make sure everyone would hear it. I always thought that if I ever met the other woman, I'd hate her on sight. I imagined someone sharp and smug, a home wrecker with perfect makeup and a cold little smile. Someone who would look me in the eye and know she had taken what was mine and enjoy it. But standing there in that bookstore cafe, face to face with Amy for the first time, I felt none of that. Instead, I felt something so unexpected, it stopped me in my tracks. Pity. I hadn't planned to meet her that day. I'd only come into the shop to cool off and clear my head. But the second I walked through the door and heard her voice, warm, excited, chatting with the barista about wedding favors, I knew exactly who she was. She stood by the local author's table, flipping through a romance novel, her shoulder-length hair tucked behind one ear, and she looked so blissfully unaware of the storm about to land in her life that I actually had to steady myself against a shelf. She didn't recognize me, of course. Why would she? To her, I was just a woman in a flowy blouse with tired eyes and too many thoughts. And before I could stop myself, I walked up beside her and said something completely ridiculous, something like, "That author's great. Her stories always start sweet and end with someone getting exactly what they deserve." She laughed, not catching the tone at all, and said, "Oh, good. That's what I need right now. Some fantasy with a satisfying ending." And I smiled, even as 1,000 things boiled under my skin. because she wasn't the villain I thought she'd be. She was just another woman waiting for someone to love her right. We talked for 10 minutes. 10 surreal, shaky, dangerous minutes, where I asked her about her wedding and she told me everything. How they were keeping it small and private, just close friends and family. How her fiancé had been through a lot and didn't want anything flashy. How his past had made him hesitant to rush things until now. I asked if his family would be there. She said no, he wasn't close to them. I asked if he'd ever been married before. She hesitated, just a flicker, but I caught it, and said, he was, once, but it was brief. It ended a long time ago. He doesn't really talk about it. I nodded slowly, heart racing, mouth dry, fingers curled into fists inside my sleeves. He'd told her I was a distant ghost, a faint chapter that didn't count. 32 years, erased with one lie. And then she said something that nearly broke me. He told me I make him feel like he's not living someone else's life anymore. I don't know how I didn't scream. I don't know how I didn't grab her by the shoulders and say, Amy, I am the someone else. But instead, I just smiled and said, that's beautiful. I hope you get everything you're hoping for. And then, without planning it, I left my coffee on the counter and walked out. My legs like jelly, my throat thick, because suddenly the game didn't feel like a game anymore. It felt like a trap, and we were both inside it. That night, I went home and sat at our dining table, my table, and stared at the dusty silverware drawer, the same one John and I had filled with wedding gifts decades ago, and I let myself feel it all. The grief, the fury, the humiliation, the weird, twisted ache of knowing he wasn't who I thought he was, and maybe never had been. But underneath all of that, something else started to grow, resolve. I didn't want to just walk into his wedding and expose him. I wanted to tear down the fantasy he'd built for himself, piece by piece, from the inside. So the next morning, I went back to that bookstore. I waited by the same table. And when Amy walked in, hair damp, cheeks flushed, I smiled and waved like we were old friends. She smiled back, walked over, and said, Hey, Linda, right? I blinked, stunned for a second, and said, Yes, actually. How did you, You left your coffee cup, she said, laughing a little. It had your name on it. I asked the barista. Just like that, I was exposed. But not fully. Not yet. She didn't connect the name. She didn't know who I was to him. Not even a flicker of suspicion. And I realized I still had time. I still had room to move. We sat down. She asked if I wanted to help her pick out a wedding gift for her fiancé. Said he was hard to shop for, private, didn't like flashy things. Maybe something symbolic, she said. He says he's finally ready to live without fear. Those words again, without fear. He kept repeating them to her, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something darker buried beneath them, something she hadn't seen and I hadn't yet uncovered. Just then, Amy's phone buzzed on the table. I saw the name flash, Jay. She picked it up, smiled faintly, and said, Sorry, give me 1 second. I nodded, but my heart was pounding. She walked a few steps away, her voice low, soft, intimate. And I saw it then. Her face shift, her eyes go still. She said, You never told me about that? No. I just thought, wait, what do you mean, technically separated? I asked you that months ago. I couldn't hear the rest. She turned away, pacing now, hand in her hair. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After a minute, she came back to the table, her smile forced, her voice quieter. Sorry, that was nothing. Just some confusion over a document. She paused. Hey, were you ever married? The question hung there like a blade. My throat tightened. I looked her in the eye and said, Yes, I was. She nodded. Did it end badly? I thought for a second, then said, It ended honestly, eventually, and I saw it. Just for a moment, a flicker of something in her eyes. Doubt, discomfort, a seed. That was all I needed. As we parted ways, she said, Maybe I'll see you again before the big day. And I smiled and replied, Oh, I wouldn't miss it. I walked out of that store with my heart thudding, my brain racing, because now she was starting to feel it, the tremor before the collapse, and John had no idea the walls were closing in. And the best part, I hadn't even laid my cards down yet. The closer it got to the wedding, the sloppier John became, and it wasn't just about timing or details, it was his mouth that kept betraying him. Little slips of the tongue that landed like quiet grenades in the middle of our conversations, and though I never reacted, never blinked, or asked questions. I filed every word away like weapons I wasn't quite ready to use. One morning, he poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of me, then mumbled, "Amy likes hers with cinnamon," before quickly correcting himself. "I mean, Maggie from the office." And when I just smiled and took a sip, he looked at me too long, as if trying to figure out whether I was playing dumb or really just slow to catch on. Another time, I asked if he could help fix the hinge on the upstairs closet, and he responded, "I've been meaning to ask the guy Amy hired for the arch if he does general repairs." And the moment her name left his mouth, he stopped, turned toward the fridge, and pretended he hadn't said anything at all. I could tell it was getting to him. He started glancing at me more, asking casual questions like, "You've been quiet lately?" Or, "Everything okay?" And I'd brush it off with, "Just tired," or, "I've got a headache." Though in truth, the pressure was building in me like a fault line. And no matter how still I tried to sit, I felt my hands trembling in the mornings, my thoughts racing too fast to sleep at night. I was holding too many truths, carrying too much weight, and the more I pretended to be fine, the more the mask began to crack. The worst of it came late Thursday evening, when he came home with a bottle of champagne and said he had something to celebrate. I watched him pop the cork, pour 2 glasses, and raise his toward mine, smiling just a little too wide. "Big weekend ahead," he said. "Big step forward." I didn't raise mine. I just looked at him and said softly, "Is it legal yet?" His smile faded for half a second before he forced it back. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, still holding the glass. I shrugged. "You said big step forward. I just meant, have you finished closing all the doors behind you?" The air in the room changed. He set his glass down too hard and said, "If this is about my work schedule, Linda, I'm doing the best I can." I smiled, stood up, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. But that was the first time I saw it in his eyes. Real fear. The dawning sense that maybe I knew more than I was letting on. The next day, while he was running errands, I took another quiet drive across town and sat in the parking lot outside Amy's OBGYN clinic, where I'd followed her schedule through a public calendar linked to a yoga studio newsletter. I hadn't expected anything huge, maybe just a checkup, maybe just more reassurance that I was 10 steps ahead. But when she walked out, clutching a small white envelope with shaking hands and tears in her eyes, I knew instantly. I didn't have to guess. I didn't even need to open her messages to confirm it. She was pregnant, and from the look on her face, somewhere between joy and terror, I also knew she hadn't told him yet. I stayed parked long after she drove off, staring at the raindrops running down my windshield, wondering how far he was willing to take this lie, wondering if he even wanted this new life, or if he was just tumbling toward it like a man too proud to admit he'd made a terrible mistake. The tragedy wasn't just that he'd betrayed me. It was that he had no idea what kind of life he was building with his bare hands. Later that night, they fought. I wasn't inside, but I heard enough from where I sat across the street in my car. Windows cracked, heart pounding. They argued in the front yard, their voices sharper than usual. No soft tones or fake calm. "You said it was finalized?" Amy said loudly. "You promised me it was over." John tried to hush her, glancing around nervously, but she wouldn't back down. "You're still married, John. You're still married to her, and you're asking me to stand up in front of people and pretend you're mine?" He said something I couldn't hear, but it made her step back and shake her head. "You think love is enough to bury a lie like this? I'm not some naive girl you can distract with flowers and promises." Then, softer, barely audible, she added, "You don't even know yet. You don't even know what's coming." I watched him try to follow her into the house, but she slammed the door behind her and left him standing on the porch like a man who'd just been shoved out of his own future. He stood there for a long time before walking back to his car, slowly, shoulders hunched, like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just watched, absorbing every detail, every gesture, every thread beginning to unravel. He hadn't told her the truth. She hadn't told him she was pregnant. And I was the only one who knew everything. The wedding was now just days away. The stage was set, and all I had to do was show up. By Saturday morning, John was spinning in circles. I could see it in the way he moved around the kitchen, checking his phone every 5 seconds, muttering things under his breath about seating charts and weather reports. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that while he was worrying about whether the flowers would be delivered on time, I had just discovered something that would blow his entire new life to pieces. It started when I went into the garage to look for an old family photo album I hadn't touched in years. At least that's what I told myself. But really, I needed to feel something solid from the life I had lived with him, something real and documented, because everything lately felt so unreal, so unsteady. Like I was walking through someone else's story wearing my own face. That's when I found the fireproof box in the back corner behind a stack of Christmas bins. The same box we'd used to store tax records and insurance papers. And when I opened it, something inside me shifted. Tucked beneath outdated W-2s and birth certificates was a legal folder I hadn't seen before. Beige, unmarked, except for a tab labeled in John's handwriting. 2024, Assets and Personal Changes. My hands were cold as I opened it, and what I found inside nearly knocked the air out of me. A property transfer request dated 6 weeks earlier. He was in the process of shifting ownership of a shared rental property to a newly created trust in Amy's name. There was a draft will with a post-it note reading, "Finalize after wedding," and under beneficiaries, my name was crossed out in pencil, not ink, pencil, like he was still deciding. And then, there it was. A life insurance policy taken out in 2006. One I thought we'd canceled years ago, still active, still listing me as the sole beneficiary. My breath caught. He had never changed it. Either he forgot, or he never meant for me to find it. I sat in the silence of that garage, staring at the paper, my mind racing with every scenario. John wasn't just rewriting our future. He was scrubbing me out of the past. But in his haste to build his new world, he'd left cracks in the foundation. And now I knew exactly where to push. I didn't confront him. I didn't shred the papers or scream, or even take them with me. I just photographed everything with my phone, returned the folder exactly as I'd found it, and calmly walked back into the house, where he was standing in the hallway adjusting his tie and talking to Amy on speakerphone. I caught just the tail end, her voice tight, controlled, asking, "You did submit the final paperwork, right? It's legal now?" And John, distracted, said, "Yes. I told you, it's handled." She paused. "Because I'm not standing up tomorrow in front of everyone unless I know she's really your ex-wife." I smiled to myself as I climbed the stairs. It wasn't handled. At the rehearsal later that day, I stood behind the last row of white chairs under a borrowed name and a borrowed invitation, one I'd intercepted from the florist's confirmation email. No one questioned me. I wore sunglasses, kept my hair pinned up, and listened carefully as the planner ran through the schedule. Her voice strained and rushed as she tried to direct everyone through a perfect, photogenic run-through. Amy was radiant but visibly tense, flinching every time John touched her shoulder, checking her phone when she thought no one was watching. He leaned toward her once, whispered something in her ear, and I saw her jaw tighten. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the body language. She was pulling away, centimeter by centimeter. A heart can only carry so many lies before it starts to rot from the inside. After the rehearsal, I slipped out before anyone noticed me, but not before I planted a small manila envelope under the driver's seat of Amy's car. A printed copy of the insurance policy and the unsigned divorce filing from our local courthouse website. No note, no explanation, just proof, because it was time for her to start asking better questions. That night, John came home late. He looked tired, confused, distracted. He poured a drink, sat at the kitchen island, and asked me quietly, "Have you been different lately?" I didn't answer. I was stirring pasta. "You just feel off," he continued. "I don't know. Like you're not really here." I turned around, spoon in hand, and smiled. "Maybe I'm already gone." He stared at me for a second, then nodded slowly and said, "Maybe you are." He didn't know how right he was. What he also didn't know was that I'd already booked a consultation with a lawyer, scheduled for Monday morning, just in case I needed to move fast. And I had. Every piece was in place now. But the final move would happen at the ceremony, because what John hadn't realized was that I wasn't coming to stop the wedding. I was coming to finish the story. The morning of the wedding, I woke up in absolute calm. No racing thoughts, no shaking hands, no panic in my chest. I sat at the vanity, brushed back my hair, and stepped into a simple white dress I hadn't worn in years. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't bridal. It was soft, elegant, and strong. like a quiet nod to the woman I used to be before everything came undone. And as I looked in the mirror, I thought, this is the last time I ever wear white for him, but it's the first time I wear it for me. I arrived early, not to make a scene, not to interrupt anything, but because I wanted to see the faces. I wanted to see who showed up for him, who still believed in the man he pretended to be. I walked in through the garden entrance, took a seat in the very back, and let the late afternoon sun settle on my shoulders as guests filtered in with polite smiles and pastel outfits. I scanned the crowd slowly, carefully, and then I saw them. His sister, Susan, sitting with her daughter in the third row, both of them with the same tired smile I'd seen at family dinners over the years. His older brother, Mark, standing stiffly near the hors d'oeuvres table, a bourbon already in his hand. These weren't strangers. These were people I'd shared holidays and hospital waiting rooms with, people who once called me our Linda, people I thought were mine, too. Susan turned, just for a moment, and our eyes met. Her smile dropped. She looked again, closer, harder, then blinked like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. I gave her the smallest nod, nothing more, and she turned away, jaw tight, whispering something to her daughter. Mark caught sight of me, too. His expression didn't change, but he held my gaze a little longer than he needed to. He knew. I could see it in the way he adjusted his collar and looked down at his drink. Then came the hush. The music changed, and there was Amy, walking down the aisle on her brother's arm, bouquet trembling in her hands. She looked pale, but still radiant, like someone holding her breath underwater, hoping to surface before she runs out of air. John stood beneath the arch, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched, like a man trying to hold too many lies in place with too little thread. The officiant began with a few generic words about love and second chances, and I felt the moment settle over the crowd like a thick fog, beautiful on the outside, but heavy with something nobody could name. When the time came for vows, John reached into his jacket, but before he could speak, Amy gently put her hand on his arm and said, "Wait." She turned to the guests. Her voice was calm, almost too soft to hear. "Before we go any further, there's someone here who might have something to say." Then she looked right at me. A ripple moved through the crowd. John blinked in confusion, then followed her gaze, and when he saw me standing up, he turned pale, truly pale, not out of guilt, but out of fear. He didn't know what I would do. He didn't know what I was holding. I walked forward slowly, never raising my voice, never rushing. I stood at the edge of the aisle and said, "Don't worry, John. I'm not here to ruin your day. I'm just here to correct it." Gasps, a few murmurs. Mark's glass tilted slightly in his hand. Susan looked like she might cry. I turned to Amy. "My name is Linda. I'm not John's ex-wife. I'm still his legal wife. You've probably heard a different story. Maybe that we were divorced long ago, or that we had nothing left between us but paper and silence. But that's not true. The papers were never filed. The divorce was never finalized, and everything he promised you, every vow, every financial agreement, every signature he gave you, is invalid." Amy didn't move. She just stared at him. Then I reached into my clutch and pulled out the envelope I had carried for weeks. "Here's the property transfer he tried to hide, the will he never finished updating, the life insurance policy that still names me as the only beneficiary, and the application for divorce, unsigned." John started to speak, some strangled explanation, but Amy held up a hand. "Stop." I looked at the crowd, not with shame, but with strength. I didn't come here to beg or to fight. I came to tell the truth, not for him, for me, and maybe for any woman in this room who's ever been lied to with a smile on her wedding day. I turned back to Amy. "I don't blame you. I know what it's like to believe a man who tells you just enough to make you feel special, but never enough to let you see the full picture. I loved him for 32 years. You barely got 12 months. I wish someone had done this for me before I wasted my time." Amy's eyes were glassy now. She didn't speak. She just let her arms fall to her sides and stepped away from John. 2 steps, then 3. Silence. Then someone in the crowd started to clap. One person, then another. And then no one else did. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was a recognition, a pulse of quiet understanding, the sound of a room recalibrating. I didn't wait for John to respond. There was nothing left to hear. I handed the envelope to the officiant and walked down the aisle, not with triumph, but with peace. As I passed Susan, she stood up and gently took my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You were always family." Outside, the sun was warmer, softer, as if the world had exhaled. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. Instead, I called my lawyer, and that night, I filed for divorce. It's strange how quietly life can shift after the loudest moment of your existence. One day you're standing in the back of a wedding, exposing 32 years of lies with a calm voice and steady hands. And the next, you're folding laundry in a new apartment with sunlight spilling across the floor and no one to answer to but yourself. I moved out of the old house 3 weeks after the wedding. That wasn't. I didn't leave in anger. I left in peace, which is a kind of victory I didn't know I had the strength to claim until I saw his face as I walked away that day. Not yelling, not breaking, just done. The divorce was quick. John didn't fight. Maybe he didn't have the strength. Maybe he thought silence would earn him pity. Or maybe he knew that everything he had built was already crumbling and the only thing left to do was get out before more came down on his head. Either way, I signed the papers with a clear mind and a light heart. When the judge stamped the final decree, I didn't feel loss. I felt weightless. And that night, for the first time in years, I slept all the way through without waking up once. Susan kept in touch. She called me 2 days after the wedding just to check in, and ended up crying on the phone, saying she didn't know how to face me. I told her she didn't have to fix anything, that I didn't hold her responsible for John's lies. We talked for almost 2 hours about our kids, our knees, her rose garden, and how hard it is to start over when the world expects you to already be settled. She told me her brother had become a stranger even to her. "He got lost," she said softly. "Somewhere along the way, he just stopped being someone I recognized, and I knew exactly what she meant." A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name in neat cursive. I opened it slowly, unsure what to expect. But the moment I read the first line, I knew it was from Amy. She wrote with grace and honesty. No anger, no bitterness. She thanked me for telling the truth before it was too late. She told me the baby was due in December and that she'd decided to raise him alone. Not because she didn't believe in forgiveness, but because she believed in boundaries. "You showed me that," she wrote. "You reminded me that silence isn't strength, that truth, even when it breaks something, is still a kind of mercy. Thank you for saving me from the life I thought I wanted." I sat with that letter for a long time, fingers tracing the edges of the paper, and I realized I hadn't just walked away from John. I'd freed someone else, too. I moved into a little town near the coast, quiet and unpretentious. The kind of place with a bakery that closes at 3 p.m. and neighbors who wave even if they've never met you. I planted herbs in the windowsill, started volunteering at the library, and picked up a watercolor set I hadn't touched since I was 25. I didn't need a grand reinvention. I just needed stillness, and from that stillness, something unexpected began to grow. His name was Daniel. We met on a Thursday at the library, when I helped him carry a box of old books he was donating after cleaning out his late mother's attic. He was kind, quiet, a retired science teacher with a soft voice, and the kind of humor that sneaks up on you. We started talking about books, about coffee, about life after 50. And there was no rush, no spark trying to set us on fire, just warmth, steadiness, the gentle unfolding of trust between two people who had both already been broken, but not destroyed. He never asked about John, not at first. And when I told him, months later, he didn't flinch. He just took my hand and said, "I'm glad you came through it. You seem like someone who deserves softness." And just like that, I felt something settle in me, something whole. And just when I thought it was all behind me, justice circled back. The kind that doesn't always come when you want it, but when you need it most. I got a call from my lawyer. Turns out, John had tried to backdate a signature on one of the financial documents he'd filed before the wedding. A foolish move. The bank flagged it. A formal investigation began. Fraud, perjury. A lawsuit followed. Civil, not criminal, but enough to freeze his assets and unravel the few threads of credibility he had left. I didn't have to lift a finger. His own lies did the work for me. Sometimes justice doesn't come like thunder. It comes quietly, like peace. Like waking up one day and realizing the war is over. Not because you won, but because you walked away from the battlefield and built something better on your own ground. Now, I spend my mornings with coffee and ocean air, my afternoons painting, and my evenings walking beside a man who never tries to complete me, just accompany me, and that's enough. Maybe that's what this whole story was about. Not revenge, not betrayal, but release, letting go of a man who spent decades pretending to love me, and finally remembering how to love myself. And if you're still listening, still with me after all this, I want to ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that when the truth came out, it felt like the floor disappeared beneath your feet? What did you do? Did you walk away? Did you stay longer than you should have? Did you find your way back to yourself? Tell me your story in the comments. Sometimes hearing what someone else survived is all we need to take the first step.